Okay.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar Motivation, Technology and Health Behavior Change. At the International Society of Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity, we organize regular webinars for the special interest group members. And this is the first webinar this year on the special interest group on theories of motivation that I'm chairing with Simon Sabir, Antonio Palmeira, and other colleagues that are part of the leading committee of this SIG. Before I go to a brief description of the webinar, introduce our presenters, just a bit of housekeeping. So these webinars are being recorded, and this is going to be available at the ISBNPA website, both in the events and the media section. And you can ask your questions throughout the webinar. So you don't need to wait to the Q&A session at the end to be able to do that. You can do it at any time, whenever there is something that you find it's really interesting, either a comment or a specific question. There is a box on the bottom of your Zoom window where you can write those questions. So we suggest that you use that instead of the chat, as it's easier to track. You can also raise your hand and have a more interactive discussion when we get to the Q&A if you prefer to do that. So just a bit about this webinar. The Special Interest Group on Theories of Motivation is a SIG on ISBNPA that is looking on how can we exchange and advance our knowledge on all the motivational dynamics, and brings different frameworks with a specific focus on the role of self-determination theory on advancing behavior change. And we try to bring different knowledge from academia and industry and practitioners in trying to understand how can we bring this motivational frameworks to improve our existing interventions in promoting sustained behavior change in the areas of physical activity, nutrition, sedentary behaviors, and other health behaviors. And although we know that motivational frameworks play a really important role in the maintenance of all of these behaviors, when it comes to developing interventions and trying to improve either individual or group motivation, applying this theoretical and evidence-based techniques can be a challenge. And in many cases, and especially in the digital interventions and in using technology, researchers and intervention designers and developers sometimes really lack clear and useful frameworks and methods to be able to address this motivational change processes with success. So in this webinar, the presenters are going to address the theoretical underpinnings and frameworks, techniques for targeting motivational determinants, and how you can apply these tools in digital and technology-assisted interventions. So both presenters will have an iterative procedure, and they will have about 30 to 40 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, on their talk, and then we'll have a good time for discussion after that. So just very quickly, I'm presenting Heather Patrick first. Heather is a researcher that is currently working at Karen Sense, a startup, as the Vice President of Behavioral Science, and she has very large experience in looking at models to promote long-term motivation and sustain behavior change in stress management, tobacco cessation, weight management, diet and physical activity, and so on. And in the last few years, Heather has gained a lot of experience on developing digital interventions, trying to bring these motivational frameworks, and she's going to explain how that can be used to optimize and evaluate interventions and products that we develop. Dustin DiTommaso is the Senior Vice President also of Behavior Change in a company called MedPal. And in the last years, as part of this company, Dustin has been trying to bring together academia and industry to be able to involve behavioral science using a human-centered design approach, and working with multidisciplinary teams to improve the design, the implementation, and the evaluation of behavior change interventions, not only on health, but also in other areas such as education and social impact. So I'm going to now give the stage to our presenters, and I'm here available if there's anything that you need.
Thanks, Marta. So while Dustin is queuing up the slides, because I gave him driving responsibilities, we're very excited about being here this afternoon, if you're in the US, or this evening, for those of you who are across the Atlantic from us. And thank you so much for carving out some time in your day or your evening to be with us. So we're going to talk with you a bit about self-determination theory, and specifically how we, and the work that we do in the private sector, are applying principles of self-determination theory in the design and development of digital technologies to promote health. Next slide.
Sorry, there you go. I can't use my Got it.
Motivation is something that we talk about a lot in common language. It's something that we hear about in popular culture. And I think it's important to keep in mind some of the assumptions that are underlying a lot of the ways that we think and talk about motivation. Many of these approaches assume that when somebody isn't doing what we want them to do, that they need to be educated, that maybe they just need to be cheered on a little bit. Maybe there's some way that we can architect the environment to make it easier for them to make the healthier choices. And then there are the somewhat more nefarious approaches of motivating with sticks, perhaps, rather than carrots. Next slide, please. But from the perspective of self-determination theory, we think that it's kind of time to rethink those traditional conceptions of motivation. Next slide. So when we talk about motivation through the lens of self-determination theory, we're really talking not just about the amount of motivation that people have, but really we're talking about the quality of that motivation. Lower motivational quality might be something that works very well in the short term, but isn't likely to lead to the kinds of long-lasting change that we're really looking for when we talk about health behavior. And this is in contrast to higher quality motivation, where we're likely to see greater engagement and persistence, particularly in the face of challenge. Next slide. So those of you who are familiar with self-determination theory are familiar with the continuum of motivation. And I'm going to start first by talking about the two ends of this continuum. Next slide. First is this issue of amotivation. And this is one of the few places where SDT really addresses quantity of motivation. And when somebody is amotivated, they tend to either lack perceived competence or they do not value the targeted behavior. And later on in the talk, I'm going to speak specifically to this issue of amotivation, because I think there's a lot of opportunity that we have in the design of digital products, but also in health behavior interventions more broadly, to more directly reach this population that has often been ignored. Next slide. On the other side of this continuum is intrinsic motivation. And this is the flavor of motivation where you see people have high levels of interest, enjoyment. The activity in and of itself is inherently satisfying. I am a runner, and I often hear people talk about this urban legend called the runner's high. I think that that's a place where we see intrinsic motivation. But in a lot of areas of health behavior change, we may not necessarily see that. Next slide. So this brings us to the subject of extrinsic motivation. And one of the things that I think self-determination theory has articulated really well is the continuum of extrinsic motivation that exists, where those flavors of extrinsic motivation can range from being really far removed from how one thinks about oneself to those places where people are a little bit more connected to those behaviors, even though they're engaging in them for some separable outcome. So on the far left of this screen, you can see we've got external regulation. This is when people are primarily motivated on the basis of rewards or punishments. And here you're likely to see the forms of behavior that are consistent with compliance, or in some cases, reactance. Next slide. Moving along the continuum, we get to introjection. So these are the types of motivation where you see people shoulding all over themselves. This is when people feel guilt, they feel shame. They're doing something out of a sense of obligation. They're either engaging in a behavior to gain approval from others or to create some form of self-acceptance. And you get a lot of ego involvement here. And so when people are motivated in primarily introjected ways, they tend to be a bit more defensive. They aren't engaging in flexible thinking. And this has huge influence when people are trying to problem solve, especially when change becomes difficult. Next slide. Next along the continuum is identification. This is the point at which we start to see that people have taken on personal meaning for the targeted behavior. They have some kind of conscious valuing of the activity. They're really personally endorsing the goal or the behavior that they're trying to approach. Next slide. And finally, you get to integration. And this is where you see a targeted behavior like a change in diet or a change in physical activity being something that the person has really drawn connection between this desired behavior and the other parts of themselves that are really important. Next slide. As I mentioned, a lot of times when we're talking about health behavior change, we aren't always going to get to intrinsic motivation. And in fact, in a lot of the work that I do around things like smoking cessation, you're not going to get intrinsic motivation there. That's never going to be fun or inherently enjoyable. It's always going to be done for some separable outcome, but there are lots of things that we can do to really move people in the direction of these more internal forms of extrinsic motivation, like identification and integration. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dustin, who's going to talk about how it is that we can facilitate this process of internalization through the support of basic psychological needs.
Great, thanks. So in SDT, in the theory, to move people through that continuum from extrinsic or controlled motivation to more authentic intrinsic forms of motivation, as Heather identified, integrated, and intrinsic, what we're really looking to do is satisfy basic psychological needs that are universal among all of us. 3 needs that each and every one of us has, that the fulfillment of these needs helps us to find reasons and authentic motivations for engaging in particular behaviors. Those 3 needs are our need for autonomy, which is our need to feel choiceful and volitional, right, as the originator of our actions, right? Self-endorsing of a behavior at the time of doing that behavior. The second need is our need for relatedness, which is our need to feel understood and valued by others within our social circles, right? So to be cared for and to care for other people within our environment, we are embedded in social structures. This sense of relatedness helps us, again, feel supported and take actions that we feel that are in our best interests, in not being forced upon us by others in our environments, which we'll talk about a bit. And also the need for competence, which is our need for personal growth and being able to overcome challenges and mastery over time. This idea of being able to be effective within our environment. And when we can fulfill these needs, we approach goals, we strive towards goals with greater strength, greater resistance, greater resilience. And when these needs are thwarted, either one or more, we tend to withdraw from particular goals and actions. Our needs get thwarted, our striving goes down, as well as our sense of well-being over time as well. So we need to think about how can we apply those needs, how can we use those needs as a lens through the design of interventions and apply those to the work that we do. At a broad level, we think about this as creating need-satisfying experiences, right? Within any kinds of interventions that we design, a designer creates a system, an intervention, a digital product, a service, a human-to-human interaction with another person that is intended to fulfill that person's needs. And when those needs are fulfilled and being met, they can take in any requests, they can strive for goals and target behaviors, and they can persist at achieving those goals over time. To do this, we can think about this as 3 pieces of a process that I think we need in order to be able to design those needs fulfilling experiences. One is having an intervention design process that supports the right methodologies, the right evidence base, the right processes for putting things out into the world that other folks can interact with. Understanding what those need satisfying ingredients are. So what is that sub-level below the needs themselves that we can repeatedly use to target different barriers and enhance needs for psychological functioning? And what is the sequencing within an intervention? In design terms, we talk a lot about user journeys and how someone progresses from that very first moment of interacting with a digital intervention to fulfilling certain goals, to engaging and re-engaging. And we'll talk about where some of these needs may be fulfilled within those different stages of the journey. And I'll show a few examples too, so we can see very tactically how some of these principles apply directly. So first, when we think about that process, I think it's important to think about how we go about designing interventions, particularly when we're collaborating with many different kinds of stakeholders: behavioral scientists, developers, experienced designers, visual designers, content people, and of course, the beneficiaries of the interventions themselves, right? Including them in that process as well, right? A very person-centered process. Understanding those needs, right? And defining the problem for our at-risk and target populations. Designing the intervention that will fulfill needs over time. Translating those needs and techniques, features, and functions. And then, of course, into whatever form factors that they need to be delivered by. And also evaluating the process all the way through, evaluating concepts for acceptability, for desirability, for usability, and then your traditional pilot testing, efficacy testing, effectiveness testing over time, right? And I think we know we can think about this as not quite a linear process, but an iterative process over time. So thinking about this process and how we get into understanding what is needed in that needs assessment for how we might think about motivation and how we might target motivation at the broad level for a population given a particular problem, as well as how we may use those same kinds of questions during an onboarding cycle or first run of an intervention to better tailor content, better tailor messages, better tailor interactions over time. So we think about setting this up very basically with a series of interviews with the populations of interests. Subject matter experts often help to triangulate, particularly in design organizations where individuals may not be cardiologists, epidemiologists, psychologists, in fact, right? So triangulating there. And it's also very important in particularly in consulting world, to understand the motivations of stakeholders, to really realize what they think and how they frame barriers, facilitators of the kinds of interventions that they're sponsoring. Do they feel like they need to implement rewards or punishments within the environment in order to facilitate action, or do they take a more holistic view of how we might motivate or help people motivate themselves through the designs that we create? So one-on-one interviews, large-scale quantitative surveys, and literature reviews to look at the evidence and understand what has been done that has been effective or not quite worked out so well through all the literature that already exists, and putting that together to create a flow where we want to look at outcome measures, the target behaviors that lead reliably to those measures, the barriers to the population of achieving those behaviors, and then the kinds of behavior change, motivational techniques, and principles that will help to overcome those barriers. In addition to those barriers, we want to think also about facilitators, tools that people might have used already, and particularly past experiences. What have people tried that has worked for them, that has not worked for them? What are their likes? What are their dislikes? How have they been approaching making changes in the past? Or are they naive, and is there a particular knowledge base that we need to instill to not only educate and train, but also to boost their sense of competence over time as well, so that they can be as most effective on that top run. Very often when we think about, if folks are familiar with the Kombi model, when we think about the different factors that go into behavior, we can think about capability, we can think about opportunity, and we can think about motivation. When we do these analyses of the barriers, I would just wanted to make a note that to state that for us, there's almost never a situation where motivation isn't an important driver of change, right? It may be a secondary function, right? So our opportunity, time, resources, how long does an activity take? How long does it take to see a benefit? These things have an effect on motivation, which is well worth targeting motivation with different techniques and principles, as well as our capability, which also has a two-way relationship between what we can do and what we know with the motivation and how effective we feel in executing behaviors. So as Heather mentioned, it becomes really useful to understand upfront what people's motivations for change are. Are they feeling direct pressure from rewards and punishments? Are they being pressured from people within their environment, doctors, workplace interventions, friends, family? Are there financial costs that are at the heart of why they may change, right? Lowering insurance bills or cost at the doctor. Do they have a sense of guilt or shame or self-image? And do they already, or can we help them find the things that are important to them that executing target behaviors or being healthy will help them achieve? And very often those things boil down to relationships with other people, particular adjuvant activities, work, life, play, fun. Sensations have a role as well, right? How do I feel? How do I feel on a day-to-day? How do I feel when I'm walking up the stairs to my work, or does my body ache? And the same with interest and enjoyment. Can we help people find where they feel like learning is a positive interaction? Can we help them express creativity? Do they like to overtake challenges? Or again, do things simply feel good? So as a summary, we want to look at multiple sources of data to help people understand and define that problem. We really want to understand the lived experiences and insights of our target population so that we can integrate that. We focus on that quality of motivation, both at a broad level with initial research, and also at an individual level when we can tailor and customize the interactions and contents of digital interventions. And as part of that process, when we have researchers and behavioral scientists working on that formative research and the intervention plan, we want to make sure that the fidelity of our intentions are translated to other teams in testing and evaluating whether or not those intentions are accurately represented when it comes time to creating interfaces and content and things like that. So to be a bit more specific, when we think about how we might satisfy those needs, we can look at different principles to support each one of those needs and digest those in a way in which we can apply them to design. So I'll give a couple for these and some examples as well. As we mentioned, supporting autonomy, supporting a person's perspective so that they can self-endorse a goal or they can self-endorse a behavior is really essential in incorporating that not only in the way we work, so that our teams, the creators of interventions, can go forward in an empathic way, but also incorporating that, that sense of perspective, those wants, likes, needs into the intervention from first run all the way through is essential. Thinking about meaningful choice. For any kinds of goals, if we think about weight loss, for example, how can we present a menu of choices or options for someone to undertake rather than being very specific in dictating single path activities, single goals to strive for, like a 10,000 step, 20,000 step, 30,000 step, and so forth? Can we help people decide how they might do something? Do I want to lose weight through dietary changes? Do I want to lose weight through physical activity? If so, what kinds of diets would I want to approach? What kinds of physical activity do I want to take on? Do I want to experiment with walking, with swimming, with handball, for example? So can we present a menu of options and encourage users to follow their own interests whenever possible? When we can't, or even when we're describing activities, providing a clear and meaningful rationale for those activities. Why is this, might this be a useful thing to do? When there isn't necessarily a variety of options, explaining why, right? It helps embed that sense of endorsement. And it's also a polite thing to do. We do it in everyday life when we ask people to do something, when we have requests for others. Our software and our technology should follow these same kinds of social interactions. And with those interactions, the same way we would with an everyday, hopefully, with an everyday conversation we may have with someone, reducing that sense of controlling language, controlling rewards and techniques, right? Rather than making demands or musts, thinking about, oops, these are out of order, sorry. Thinking about the things that you might do or could do. When we think about relevance, that idea of when we frame an activity, when we frame feedback, explaining exactly why. What is the context beyond just numeric values, more steps, more miles, less calories, providing information that expands that context to help people internalize it. Why is it beneficial? Framing that as a positive, moving 5 minutes for every hour. Your sitting helps your body loosen up, right? What is the other added context that we can provide? And on the other side, right, explaining again why keeping track of daily symptoms, what benefit is there, and why that might be something that someone may find useful. And again, doing that in a way that frames it as why might you versus why you must, why might you versus should. Let's help you find your way versus precisely here's how to change and we're going to change you. Help people find their own reasons for change and making that clear within the content and the interactions of our design. When we think about designing for competence, understanding that we can help people set goals, meeting people where they are, and setting realistic expectations about what they might achieve as a result of taking on particular new behaviors, right? We see this a lot in weight loss as well when we think about what are expected weight loss ranges for making dietary or physical activity advancements, right? So not only what is expected, but what is safe. Thinking about relapse or lapse and relapse when smoking, what is the likelihood of those kinds of effects when one is striving to reduce the number of cigarettes or quitting? And Heather will talk about that a bit. With that idea of meeting people where they are, being able to tailor their goals and activities for people's individual skills and abilities. If we can allow people to input what they feel is the right amount of activity, the right amount of behavior versus dropping a 20,000 step challenge upon them on day one, understanding where they are, taking that time, and letting them find the right spot and escalating that over time. As they do this, we want to build skills, provide the structure and feedback for improving those skills over time, and making sure that feedback is on progress, is on performance, and it's presented in a non-judgmental way. Very often what we see in digital interventions is grand displays of data. I think this is my sleep data over time with a particular application that shows what time I went to bed, what time I woke up, the date, and some variation of sleep depth. And that's really all it does. It doesn't allow for any context. It doesn't pull for any insights or let me know why or I might have slept less well or more poorly than other times, and give me advice or techniques to try to improve over time. It's missing that sense of context, which very often results in frustration and not knowing exactly how to improve. It's just a retrospective look at what I've done over time without any techniques to help me move forward and improve that data. So when we think about creating feedback, we want to do more than just show data. If we could show feedback that allows for a sense of positive emotion so that I can do more, right? If we can show an increased ability that I have done more than I have previous, instilling that sense of competence and creating a call to action to show that there is more to do. I can do more if I should choose. So when we think about feedback loops, not just showing data for data's sake, but helping us to create that sense of positive emotion. I want to do more. Increased ability, I can do more. And hey, guess what? There's more that you can do. Maybe there's some things in here that are interesting to you and you would like to try. When we think about designing for relatedness, we want to help enrich those relationships people have with each other, not only in the application or within the service, but also creating dedicated strategies to help people connect and reach out to get social support in their everyday lives, in the real world, thinking about how we can foster that through digital software, either creating modes where a support system, a buddy, an important other can interact with you, or actually giving people content and strategies so that they can reach out and talk to other people outside of the app to get the support they need. Very often when we think about workplace wellness interventions, there is an overabundance of competitions and contests. An underutilized technique that would be more supportive of relatedness needs is thinking about collaborative goal setting and collaborative striving towards goals. How can we or more than one person help each other reach goals, either individual goals or striving together towards a single goal where all of our actions, when all of our contributions help to add up to that sum, rather than creating one-on-one, head-to-head, team-to-team competitions, right? Reducing that sense of very often adversarial techniques and striving for a more collaborative environment in goal setting and goal striving. Making sure that that content is personalized when we think about the intake and onboarding, setting up people's desired goals, their values, their aspirations, and feeding content that feels personalized, that feels tailored to instill that sense of relatedness from the software and the interactions themselves. And again, much like as individuals, we want to move forward designing products with a sense of empathy. We want a sense of compassion to come through in the voice and tone, right? Really understanding where people are, noticing that they may have struggles, they may have slips, and supporting folks along the way with whatever behavior change activities that we've set up for them within the interventions that we've developed. So we can see how this might take effect in medication adherence, for example, when we think about supporting other individuals with something like antiretroviral therapies, something that you may not want to share within a large community, but you may be comfortable sharing that with an important other within your life, and getting that kind of support, right? So setting that up within the interventions that we create. Would you like a buddy to support you? At that very individual, intimate level, supports relatedness. On the other side of it, we can look at communities where that's appropriate. So designing scaled communities where people making similar changes, dealing with similar chronic conditions, can communicate together, can share advice, can share tips. Practical emotional support is a great way to keep people engaged, to give people adjuvant activities to do outside of skills building, outside of tasks, outside of the specific target behaviors they have. Those communities can often be a very strong active ingredient to keep people engaged and keep them striving for their goals. We can see this a lot in games as well, that idea of collaboration, where people have individual roles. This is a screenshot from a game called World of Warcraft, where the game is designed so that 3 people work together as a unit in fighting battles, where one person is a damage dealer, where they inflict damage upon an enemy horde. One person is a tank who absorbs damage and protects the other 2. And the third person who stands back and is a healer who heals both of those 2 individuals in the front. They each have a very unique role that caters to the strengths designed in the game. But can we think about how to cater to individual strengths within an intervention and assist people to be at their best, to make the changes at a level and pace that they want to make those changes, and how they can be supportive or a mentor to other people within an intervention. So really thinking about this idea of individual roles. And then again, thinking about the system and the language itself. This is, there's a movie called Moon, when we're looking at virtual avatars and contexts. Are we communicating with clarity, with compassion, with empathy through the requests, through the messaging, through the communication channels that we're adopting in our digital interventions? I'll go really quickly through this because I know we have a case study too. When we think about sequencing, right? So if we take those different principles and fit them in, very often typical sequences of interventions, we want to think about that intention and predecision when people first become aware, when they download an application, intake and onboarding, that first run, what do we need to collect for data that we can use to customize and tailor that experience? Initiation of change, making those first steps and supporting people, maintaining that change over time, preventing relapse, and also outreach and re-engagement when people disappear and we haven't collected any information back or seen any engagement from analytics within our applications. I'm going to skip a couple of these things. As I mentioned earlier, really seeking to understand the user during onboarding and explore their motivations, exploring their big picture goals and values as a first run on intake and onboarding. And we can see that manifest here, right? So if we're thinking about values and why a person wants to be healthy, wants to be physically active, wants to manage a chronic condition, we can ask very explicitly to enter text, or type something away, but we can also be creative with design and think about other form factors. Uploading a photo, for example, whether that's something of a family, whether that's a vista that they want to visit or see, a mountain that they want to hike. So thinking about different creative ways to help people think about their values, their reasons, their motives for change, and enlisting that as a first run within an intake session. I've mentioned before, supporting with the right amount of knowledge, providing the what, why, and the how on behaviors, finding those opportunities for growth and for action. And from a design perspective, really making sure that our language that we use in the writing and reading level is clear, is understandable, and doesn't get in the way or impede people's sense of competence. An idea that we like to explore is thinking about covering your bases, right? When we're helping people to onboard to new experiences, getting baseline data, helping them set goals and action plan, monitoring those actions and outcomes, and creating experiments and framing tasks and activities as experiments so that this a sense of failure and safety is there for them, so they don't feel like the stakes are too high and that they can rebound when they have setbacks, or they can find new activities that are more interesting or more in line with their goals. And we can see this play out in an application that we designed here, where we specifically set up activities for hypertension around experiments, right? Knowing target behaviors of medication adherence, physical activity, stress, diet, and allowing people to have a menu of options of different kinds of experiments by which they may take, exploring their motivation for why once they've chosen a particular experiment, so that we can fine-tune messages and interactions, providing problem solving when we notice that they may have gone off track, and then helping people find solutions, giving progress feedback over time, and then meaningful insights, not just the data, but key insights. You were most successful in managing when you took your medication with in the morning with breakfast, right? So not just did it, didn't do it, didn't do it, but here precisely is what we found is when you've been more successful. You've now learned something, you've gained an insight, you felt more competent, you have a real world strategy that you can bring in outside of the application to help you make changes and sustain those changes. I'm going to bring us quickly through this. We also want to think about maintenance, and in digital, in face-to-face and offline interventions, we often think of maintenance as being when the intervention itself ends. We often think of maintenance in digital as ongoing, right? It continues to go on, but the way that people interact with the application may change over time, right? We want to check in on people's motivations. They may have changed over time. Their aspirations may have changed. They have met particular goals and changes. And we want to create this continued blend of experimenting, of growth, of new opportunities to focus on, allowing them to recalibrate their goals, and exploring those adjuvant activities like community, like mentoring, that help keep people engaged, give them a sense of purpose, and very often tend to give back and keep people engaged over time. Here, I'm going to skip this. I think I've covered that information a bit earlier, and turn it back over for Heather and a case study.
Great, thanks, Dustin. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So one of the things that I've been particularly interested over the last several years is this issue of amotivation. And what do we do with people in the context of behavior change, and particularly in the context of digital interventions, when people are not especially motivated? I think we have a lot of great opportunities here that may have been missed in a lot of the work we've traditionally pursued in academic research. Next. So when people are not motivated, I think it's really important for us to understand why they're not motivated. So there are some people who fall into the I won't camp. And there are lots of different ways that you might perceive people who say, nope, not going to do it. One way is to say, well, they're stubborn and ridiculous. And that is one interpretation, and it may in fact be what's happening. But I think a lot of times when somebody says they're not going to make a change, what they're really trying to convey is that there are other things that are happening in their lives that are demanding of their attention and their time and financial resources right now. And it's overwhelming for them to contemplate change. When we are in the business of trying to promote health behavior change, these are complex things for people to move toward. They have to reorchestrate their entire lives in many cases, whether we're talking about someone who's trying to manage their weight or manage a chronic condition like diabetes, or if they're trying to be more physically active, or if they're trying to quit smoking. Next. There's also the group of folks who fall into the I can't bucket. And I think this is true for a lot of people who look like they're not motivated for change. Oftentimes when somebody comes to our digital application or even to our interventions, this is not their first rodeo. They have tried and failed multiple times before, and they feel often very defeated by it. They feel like, I've tried a gazillion times. Why is this time going to be any different? Why would I set myself up for failure? Next. There are also times where people feel really ambivalent. They may recognize very much the importance of the behavior change and see the value in it, but for a variety of reasons aren't really sure if they're ready to take the next step moving toward that change. Next. And then finally, I think the role of relatedness in a motivation is one that we have a great opportunity to better understand, whether that's in a clinical encounter or that's in the context of developing an intervention. When we look at the range of behaviors that we on this webinar are involved in working with people on, we live in cultures where there is a high sense of personal responsibility for your own health and for maintaining your health and all of those kinds of things. And often people feel very judged and blamed for where they currently are. Oh, I've developed diabetes. That's because I was really a slacker and I didn't do a good job of eating well and being physically active, and I let my weight get out of control. We hear this all the time in working with people who smoke, who feel a tremendous amount of social shame and stigma and judgment because they continue to smoke, which is an addictive behavior, but it's not often viewed as that at a cultural level. They're often viewed and feel like they are being viewed as personal failures. And that reflects a real disconnect there in their relatedness needs being met. Next. So what if we designed an intervention intentionally for people who aren't yet ready to change? Next. So here, I'm going to talk about some of the work that I've been involved with over the last year with my company, Carrot. Our product is called Pivot. And we have designed a smoking cessation program that doesn't start with quit. So this would also be very similar to having somebody come in who's trying to lose weight, and you don't start with having them set a weight loss goal, or you don't start with somebody setting exercise goals right out of the gates. Next. The Pivot program is three-pronged, and I'm going to talk first about the app. The app is a year-long program that's executed in 6 phases. And it's really in these first 2 phases, explore and build, that we've intentionally designed a runway for people who are not yet ready to make a quit attempt. And here I'm going to talk a bit more about the explore phase because that's where we've got some data right now. Explore is 9 days in duration. We don't talk about quitting during this phase at all. We focus really on encouraging people to engage in some self-reflection and do some self-monitoring of behaviors. This includes the use of a carbon monoxide breath sensor, which lets people know how much exhaled carbon monoxide they have. This is a good indication of how much exposure they've had to cigarettes during the day. We also ask them to maintain a cigarette log so they get a better sense of sort of the patterns of smoking behavior. They have daily activities that they complete within the context of the app that are really intended to help encourage some self-reflection for them to see how they're spending their time, where that time is being spent on smoking. They have an opportunity to explore both why they smoke, because we recognize that smoking is serving a purpose for them, and if they were to decide to quit, why they might want to do so. Next slide, please. So this is a bit of an illustration. You can see on the top left quadrant here, this is our carbon monoxide breath sensor. This is our first generation device. On the right, you can see the dashboard that people are able to see. The green dashboard shows how you can see the ways that smoking, cigarettes log, and carbon monoxide fluctuate over the course of not only within a day, but over several days. On the bottom left, those first 3 phone screenshots, those are of an activity where people are able to see not only how much money they're spending on cigarettes, but then they also get to engage in this aspirational thing of thinking about, if you weren't spending that money on cigarettes, like this is how much you would spend in a year, what would you want to buy with that money instead? I think one of the things that's really interesting about that activity is it really does tap into people's values in an important way, because it says, you've chosen to spend money on this one thing, in this case, cigarettes. If you weren't spending it on cigarettes, what would be important to you? And we see people upload pictures of things like vacations and things that they want to do with their family or home improvements. And yes, those are financial things, but they're reflective of larger values and the things that are really important to people. Finally, all of our participants are assigned a dedicated human coach that they interact with via in-app chat. And so you can see here on the bottom right that we've got the way that we introduce a coach and for the user to learn something about the coach and how they see those messages from them. Next. One of the things that is really important to us just right off the bat is to really foster this sense of relatedness for people. And so here are a couple of sample coaching interactions where these are first interactions with a person. And the coach is asking the participant things like, what's one thing you want me to know about you and smoking? Really trying to tap into some of these relatedness dimensions. I want to understand how this fits into your life, why it's important to you. And then the flip side of that is, what's one thing you think other people really don't get about you and smoking? And you can see here, these are from actual conversations. And these are people's responses. And I think it's interesting and very telling that you see in this one on the left, somebody saying outright, like, I'm just really curious if you've ever smoked or if someone you know has ever smoked. And that's a real expression of, I want to be sure you really understand me. And then the person on the right is acknowledging some of the social shame that they've experienced for being someone who smokes. Next. We also have a really great opportunity here to hear from people where their introjects are, where they're kind of engaging in some self-flogging, where they're being really hard on themselves. And so this was a participant who said that when they smoke, they feel shameful and powerless. And the coach did a really cool thing here, which is they flipped this on its head and said, I hear what you're saying and I acknowledge that, but what makes you feel strong and in control? And this was an opportunity, again, for a person to engage in some really meaningful aspirational reflection on how quitting smoking could help this person to feel really empowered. And so you can see that here in this interaction. Next. So here's what we've got so far with some data. Next. We recruited participants who were 30 to 55 years old who smoke at least 5 cigarettes per day. They did a baseline assessment. They completed this first 9 days of our program with Explore, and they did an exit interview and a survey. This was just a small feasibility study. We wanted to see how real humans deal with this in the wild. 48 enrolled and 41 completed. We had 3 measures of attitudes toward quitting smoking. We asked people how difficult they thought it would be if they were to quit now. We asked them how successful they expected to be, and we also asked them how ready they were to quit smoking. All 3 of these items were answered on a 1 to 10 scale, where 1 is the lower end of the scale and 10 is the more positive end of the scale. Next. So this is just a breakdown of our participants. They were about half men, half women. We had an average age of 43 years. They smoked on average a little over a half a pack a day, and they had been smoking on average about 22 years. 85% of the sample were daily smokers. Next. Here you can see some information about how participants were engaging with the use of the carbon monoxide breath sensor and with cigarette logging over the course of the study. Day 1 was the day that they came into the study and they registered, so they didn't have a full day. The self-monitoring behaviors peaked in the first couple of days of the study and then sort of gradually tapered off, which is common and something that you would expect to see in free-range humans, and also you've probably seen in your study samples, particularly when somebody's not got a device that they're just putting on their body and wearing for eternity. Next. In terms of activity completion, we had really solid completion rates on each of the in-app activities that were unlocked for participants on a daily basis. Participant completion rates were at 80% or greater for all 9 of the activities in this phase of the program. Next. And we also had really strong engagement with the in-app coaching experience, which was something we were especially interested in seeing. A lot of folks have asked us, like, well, how are you sure people will be able to establish relationships through texting with their coach? Is it the same as telephonic? Is it, how does that work? And what we saw here was that we had really good engagement, not only from coaches sending things to participants, but for participants responding back. Next. What we were especially excited to see were these strong, significant improvements in attitudes toward quitting. We saw that perceived difficulty was lower, anticipations of success higher, and readiness to quit also higher over the 9 days. And just as a reminder, we aren't telling people to choose a quit date. We're not really talking about quitting, all of that. And we also saw that 78% of our participants reported that they decreased the number of cigarettes that they smoked per day over the course of the study, suggesting that having the use of that carbon monoxide breath sensor was something that was really powerful and really turned the light on for folks. Next. And that's all we got. So we've got a few minutes left for questions. I've been following them as they've popped up on the Q&A and also in the chat. Marta, do you want to help moderate this for us, please?
Yes, sure. So there are a few questions. We'll try to answer as much as possible, but we're running a bit short on time. So those that we can answer them later by email or put a text online on the website. So looking at the questions, they're all quite interesting. I tried to organize them in terms of categories. And most of the questions are about designing autonomy and wanting to know more about specific aspects of how to design digital interventions for autonomy. So there are 3 questions that are asking about how can empathy be designed in a way that is motivating but avoiding a feeling of victimization? How can you structure a meaningful choice? And when you're using that in an intervention, how can you account and respect participants that don't see an issue on their current behavior? And that's a question that is very common. And also, how can rewards be structured in a way that they don't thwart autonomy? So both of 3 aspects are related to autonomy. So empathy, looking at meaningful choice in a way that also respects those that don't want to change their behaviors, and using rewards in a way that it doesn't thwart autonomy. So Heather and Dustin, you can start answering and commenting on those.
Empathy first, too. You?
Sure. So I actually know the question asker of that one. Hi, Dad. I think that's an important question. Because there's a very fine line between empathy that conveys that you feel sorry for a person versus empathy that conveys your interest in understanding a person. And conveying your interest in understanding a person supports higher quality motivation, in large part because it supports that feeling of relatedness. But it's also that when you are conveying understanding of a person, or even an interest in understanding a person, that helps to better align you with their interests and not with your agenda for them to achieve a certain outcome.
Great. Yep. Let's see.
Do we want to take the rewards question next, Dustin?
Yeah, I don't remember quite what the rewards was.
So it's basically
the question
how you use rewards in ways that are not thwarting of autonomy.
Great. Shall I? Let's see. So when we think about using rewards within interventions, whether those are digital or otherwise, we can think about it in a few ways. As Heather mentioned a moment ago, finding ways to tie those rewards to bigger picture life goals and aspirations. What does this afford me to do that is at a higher level, macro level goal, rather than pure monetary transactional financial rewards? Thinking about ways to, if we are using rewards, so that they're not contingent, where they may be more effort-based rather than do this to get that. Minimizing the actual value of those rewards, right? So less tangible rewards. Other techniques that you can use to, when you do or when you have to use them, is if it is a tangible reward, if there's been some studies that show autonomy is less thwarted when those rewards are used on acquiring things that are right in the neighborhood of the behavior change itself. So within physical activity, if those rewards lead to things like gear or things that help one improve their ability or improve their competence over time to make changes more easily, better, have a sense of progress. Those kinds of techniques can work and minimize autonomy less. Anything to add?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is you can also think about rewards in sort of gamifying, which is something we do a lot in digital health, well, in most digital interfaces. And while there is, the earning of points and badges and those kinds of things that can be a little silly sometimes in health contexts, I think they can also be a really good mechanism to convey progress, which is a really great way to help people build a sense of confidence and to see that they're making improvements even if they haven't yet achieved their goal.
Great.
And the other question related with autonomy is about meaningful choice and how you can account for meaningful choice and respect participants that are unmotivated or don't see they have any problem.
Yeah, so I think this is an area where it's really important to ask yourself if you think that the person really truly believes that the way things are going currently is great and there are zero problems, or if there's something else that's in the way. Working in tobacco, I've never spoken with a single person who smokes who doesn't know that it's going to kill them, and yet they continue to smoke. At lunchtime, I could walk down to any fast food restaurant and I guarantee you that there is not a single person in there who thinks they're making a healthy choice, and they're there. And so I think we have to be careful about making the assumption that just because somebody isn't ready to make the change that we think they want, that they're okay with the way things currently are. I think what we need to understand is why are things okay the way they are for that person? They're serving a purpose, and so there's something to take a look at there. But I think it's also an opportunity, and we can do this in digital because we have greater capacity to tailor on the fly through well-designed digital interventions that allow for people to choose other goals, right? Like we might think that, hey, losing 7% of your starting body weight would be really good and really important for your health, but that may not be the thing that's most important to that person. Maybe what's most important to that person is sleeping better. And if they lost a little bit of weight, they'd be able to sleep better. And so maybe your intervention is able to focus on not setting the goal at 7% of, losing 7% of your weight, but making some changes to when and how much they eat so that they're getting higher quality sleep. And that might then spill over into that other goal, which is around weight management. But I think that's one of the things we get to do in digital that we can't always do in other contexts.
Thank you both. I'm conscious that we are a bit over time at the moment. So we will try to answer the other questions by email. We have all the emails, we have all the text, so we'll try to do it. The webinar will be available the presentations were great, really amazing. Thank you so much, both of you. I know we could stay here for 2-3 hours discussing all of this, and I think that's what we are trying to promote with this SIG. So we'll have other webinars and other opportunities at the conference or other situations to continue to discuss how we can improve digital interventions by bringing motivational frameworks such as self-determination theory to the game. So thank you, everyone, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.